It starts with a flower, a delicate, papery bloom called Papaver somniferum. To the ancient Greeks, it was a gift from Morpheus, the god of dreams. To the medieval physician, it was the giver of life, the only thing on earth that could stop a person's pain. But to the British Empire in the 1800s, it was something else entirely. It was the world's first truly global, high-stakes, industrial-scale illicit drug trade. Today, we think of drug cartels as shadowy figures in jungles or back alleys. But in the 19th century, the biggest drug cartel on the planet was a corporation, the British East India Company, and its board of directors sat in mahogany-paneled rooms in London. They didn't just sell opium. They used it to pivot the entire global economy, bankroll an empire, and humiliate the most powerful nation in the East. This is Chapter 1, The Golden Flower's Curse. To understand why a flower caused a war, you have to understand a very British problem: tea. By the late 1700s, Britain was obsessed with Chinese tea. It wasn't just a drink. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. But there was a catch. The Chinese emperor, Qianlong, wasn't interested in anything Britain had to sell. He famously told King George III, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects that are strange or ingenious." China would only accept one thing for their tea: silver. Cold, hard Spanish bullion. For decades, Britain watched its national wealth literally sail away to Beijing, ending up locked in the emperor's vaults. The British treasury was bleeding out. They needed a product, something the Chinese couldn't say no to, something addictive. Enter the poppy. The British East India Company realized that the fertile plains of Bengal, India, were the perfect place to grow high-grade opium. Now, opium wasn't new to China. It had been used as medicine for centuries, but the British had a different plan. They refined it, mass-produced it, and created a free market for addiction. Here is the clever and deeply cynical part. The East India Company didn't technically sell opium in China. They knew it was illegal there. Instead, they sold it at public auctions in Calcutta to private merchants. These smugglers would then ship the chests to the coast of China, where they'd bribe local officials to look the other way. By 1830, the British were smuggling 30,000 chests of opium into China every single year. Each chest weighed about 140 pounds. Do the math, that is millions of pounds of narcotics flooding a country that had officially banned it. Now, you might think, how did they get away with this? The answer is the hulks. These were massive, decommissioned ships anchored just outside Chinese waters. They were floating warehouses. Smugglers would pull up in fast crabs, long, narrow boats powered by 50 or 60 oarsmen, grab the opium and dash to the mainland. If the Chinese Navy tried to chase them, the British ships were simply too fast and too well armed. By 1838, the tea problem was solved. The silver was no longer flowing into China. It was flowing out. The British had successfully turned a massive trade deficit into a massive profit, all on the backs of millions of Chinese citizens who were now hopelessly addicted. But in Beijing, the emperor had seen enough. The social fabric of China was tearing. Soldiers were too high to fight. Officials were too high to govern. He appointed a man of legendary integrity to fix the problem: Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin didn't just send a polite letter. He wrote to Queen Victoria herself, asking her, "Where is your conscience?" He pointed out the hypocrisy. Opium was strictly regulated in Britain, yet they forced it upon China. Victoria never replied. So Lin took action. He marched into the foreign warehouses in Canton, blockaded the merchants, and seized 20,000 chests of opium. He didn't steal it. He didn't sell it. He dug massive trenches, mixed the opium with lime and salt water, and flushed it into the sea. To the Chinese, this was a heroic stand for sovereignty. To the British merchants, this was theft of private property. And in London, the drums of war began to beat. The golden flower had done its job. It had given the British Empire the excuse it needed to stop being merchants and start being conquerors. When Commissioner Lin Zexu flushed 2.6 million pounds of British opium into the South China Sea, he thought he was ending a plague. In reality, he was lighting a fuse. In London, the Opium Lobby, a group of powerful merchants led by William Jardine, successfully argued that this wasn't about drugs. It was about free trade and the insult to the British flag. The British response wasn't a diplomatic mission. It was a fleet, and at the heart of that fleet was something the world had never seen before: the HMS Nemesis. It was the first iron-hulled, steam-powered warship ever sent to the East. To the Chinese defenders, who were still using wooden junks and bows and arrows, the Nemesis didn't look like a ship. It looked like a monster. It could sail against the wind, up shallow rivers where no wooden ship dared go, and its massive cannons could outrange anything the Emperor possessed. This wasn't just a war between two nations. It was a war between 2 centuries. The British infantry were armed with modern muskets that worked in the rain. The Chinese soldiers, the bannermen, were often still using matchlock guns, primitive weapons where you had to literally keep a piece of rope burning to fire. If it rained, their guns were useless. As the British fleet sailed up the Yangtze River, they didn't just fight the military. They held the entire economy hostage. They captured the Grand Canal, the vital artery that fed the capital of Beijing. They were essentially cutting the throat of the Chinese Empire. The Emperor, sitting in the Forbidden City, was receiving reports that defied belief. His generals were lying to him, claiming great victories, while the British were systematically dismantling his coastal defenses. One of the most haunting moments of the war happened at the Battle of Chapu. The Manchu bannermen, realizing they could not defeat these iron demons, chose a path that shocked the British officers. Rather than surrender and face the shame of the Opium War, entire families, men, women, and children, committed mass suicide as the British entered the city. A British officer later wrote that he felt a loathing for the war after seeing the carnage. But the merchants of death in London didn't feel the same. To them, the China market was finally opening. By 1842, the Chinese Empire was on its knees. They had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Nanking. This is one of the most significant documents in human history, but for China, it is known as the start of the century of humiliation. Here is what the British demanded: 21 million silver dollars ** as compensation for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. Yes, the victim of the drug trade was forced to pay the dealer for the drugs they seized. 5 treaty ports ** were opened to British merchants, including Shanghai. The island of Hong Kong ** was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. Extraterritoriality **. This meant that any British citizen in China was no longer subject to Chinese law. They could commit a crime and only be tried by a British judge. But here is the most toxic part of the history. The Treaty of Nanking didn't even mention the word opium. It didn't legalize it, but it didn't ban it either. It left it in a gray zone that allowed the trade to explode. With the ports open and the Chinese government humiliated, the floodgates opened. Within a decade, opium imports doubled again. The golden flower was no longer just a drug. It was a weapon of statecraft. The British had discovered that you didn't need to colonize an entire country if you could simply make its population dependent on your product. The smoke of the Opium Wars would linger for over 100 years. It would trigger the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war in human history, and it would eventually lead to the collapse of the 2,000-year-old Chinese imperial system. But the story doesn't end with a treaty, because the ghost of the poppy was about to travel across the ocean, following the very trade routes the British had built, and it was coming for the West. History has a way of coming full circle, often in the most tragic ways possible. By the mid-1850s, the British were frustrated. Even after winning the First Opium War, the Chinese government was still dragging its feet on full legalization. So, the British, this time joined by the French, sparked a second Opium War. They marched all the way to Beijing, burned the breathtaking old summer palace to the ground, and finally forced China to officially legalize the opium trade. For a moment, the merchants of death had won everything. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, the golden flower's curse began to migrate. The very same substance the British used to break China was now being refined, repackaged, and rebranded by a rising industry in the West, Big Pharma. In 1874, a British chemist synthesized a stronger, safer version of morphine. By 1898, the German company Bayer was marketing it as a cough suppressant for children. They called it heroin. They claimed it was non-addictive. Sound familiar? The tactics hadn't changed, only the salesman had. The British East India Company had used the free trade argument to push addiction onto a nation. Now, pharmaceutical companies were using medical progress to push it into every household in Europe and America. By the early 1900s, there were opium dens in San Francisco, London, and New York. The ghost of the poppy had followed the silver back to the West. But the political fallout was even more explosive. In China, the century of humiliation, sparked by the Opium Wars, created a deep, generational scar. It fueled the rise of the Boxer Rebellion and, eventually, the Communist Revolution. Mao Zedong's rise to power was built, in part, on a promise to cleanse China of the foreign poisons that had broken its spirit. To this day, China's extremely strict drug laws and its geopolitical stance toward the West are rooted in the memory of those British steamships appearing on the Yangtze. Even as the official opium trade died out in the 1900s, the infrastructure remained. The secret jungle routes in the Golden Triangle and the hidden valleys of Afghanistan, places where the poppy was once grown for empires, became the lawless hubs for the modern heroin trade. The wars for control never stopped. They just went underground. And that brings us to the present. If you look at the modern opioid crisis, where synthetic opioids like fentanyl are devastating communities, the echoes of the 1830s are deafening. We see the same pattern. A powerful entity, once a corporation state, now a corporation, pushes a highly addictive substance, downplays the risk of addiction, and reaps massive profits while the social fabric of the target population unravels. History is often taught as a series of dates and names, but the toxic history of opium is a lesson in power. It shows us what happens when the pursuit of profit is placed above human life on a global scale. It shows us that a flower can be more dangerous than a fleet of warships if it is used to target the human mind. For Brew Lore, this story is more than just a tale of the past. It's a reminder that the world we live in, the borders of Hong Kong, the laws of international trade, and even the pills in our medicine cabinets, were all shaped by a 19th century drug war that most of the world has forgotten. The British East India Company is gone. The Qing dynasty is gone. But the poppy remains. And as long as there is a profit to be made from dreams, the wars for control will continue. If you want to see how other innocent commodities like salt or pineapples shape the world, click the video on your screen now. And as always, thanks for watching.